On a humid Sunday morning in July 1925, a crowd of nearly 3,000 people packed into a Tennessee courthouse to witness what would become one of the most theatrical trials in American history. The Scopes Monkey Trial, as newspapers dubbed it, pitted William Jennings Bryan, three-time presidential candidate and Presbyterian elder, against Clarence Darrow, the agnostic defense attorney from Chicago. But here's what your history textbook probably didn't tell you. This wasn't really about evolution or science. It was the opening salvo in a war that would dismantle the centuries-old power structure of American religious authority, and the religious establishment lost before they even realized they were fighting. The collapse I'm talking about didn't happen overnight. It didn't come with dramatic announcements or revolutionary manifestos. Instead, it unfolded across nearly a century through a series of seemingly unrelated events, court decisions, technological shifts, and cultural transformations that systematically stripped mainline Protestant denominations of the cultural authority they'd held since before the American Revolution. And remarkably, most Americans never noticed it happening. Let me take you back to understand what was lost. In 1890, if you wanted to understand your place in American society, you looked to your denomination. The Episcopal Church governed the upper classes and political elite. Presbyterians dominated education and banking. Methodists organized the expanding middle class. Baptists and their various conventions held sway over vast swaths of the South and rural America. These weren't just churches. They were parallel power structures that rivaled and sometimes exceeded the authority of government itself. Consider this staggering fact. In 1906, religious organizations in America controlled more property than the federal government. The Methodist Episcopal Church alone owned assets valued at over $400 million, which in today's dollars would be approximately $13 billion. But it wasn't just about money. Denominational authorities could make or break political careers, determine who received education, decide which businesses thrived, and even influence who married whom. When the Presbyterian General Assembly issued a statement, senators paid attention. When the Methodist bishops spoke, governors listened. The denominations controlled something even more powerful than wealth. They controlled information and knowledge. Before public libraries became widespread, church libraries and denominational publishing houses were the primary sources of books for millions of Americans. The Methodist Book Concern, established in 1789, was the largest publisher in America throughout much of the 19th century. They didn't just publish hymnals and Bibles, they published textbooks, political treatises, scientific works, and novels. They decided what ideas reached the American public. But something strange started happening in the 1920s, right around the time of that courthouse in Tennessee. The denominations began to fracture internally in ways they never had before. The fundamentalist modernist controversy that erupted across Protestant denominations between 1920 and 1935 wasn't just a theological debate. It was a civil war that revealed something shocking. The denominational hierarchies had lost the ability to enforce consensus among their own members. Take the Presbyterian Church as an example. In 1910, the General Assembly had issued the Five Fundamentals, declaring certain beliefs non-negotiable for all Presbyterian ministers. By 1927, they couldn't even discipline ministers who openly denied those same fundamentals. When the New York Presbytery ordained 2 ministers who refused to affirm the virgin birth, the General Assembly tried to intervene. They failed. The denomination discovered it had no real enforcement mechanism. Its authority existed only as long as people voluntarily submitted to it, and people were starting to stop submitting. The same pattern repeated across denominations. The Northern Baptist Convention fractured. The Disciples of Christ split. The Methodists barely held together. But here's the twist. The public fights over theology obscured a much more significant transformation happening beneath the surface. Americans were developing new sources of authority that competed with denominational leadership, and these new sources were winning. The first competitor was professional expertise. As American universities expanded dramatically in the 1920s and 1930s, they created a new class of credentialed experts, psychologists, sociologists, economists, educators, who claimed authority based on scientific training rather than theological wisdom. When Americans wanted to know how to raise children, they increasingly turned to child psychologists like John B. Watson rather than their denominational literature. When they needed guidance on social issues, they consulted sociologists rather than bishops. The denominations tried to fight back by creating their own experts, but this only legitimized the idea that expertise, not ecclesial office, conferred authority. Here's a fascinating detail that illustrates this shift. In 1925, the Presbyterian Church published a survey revealing that 85% of their members said they would consult their pastor about a moral dilemma. By 1955, only 42% said the same. Where did the other 43% turn? Doctors, therapists, advice columnists, and increasingly, their own individual conscience informed by mass media. And mass media was the second great competitor. Radio fundamentally altered the landscape of religious authority in America. Before radio, if you wanted to hear religious teaching, you went to your local church and heard your denominationally approved minister. Radio demolished that monopoly. By 1930, there were more than 60 full-time religious radio stations in America, and hundreds more general stations broadcasting religious content. And here's the crucial point. Radio preachers didn't need denominational approval. They needed ratings and donors. Charles Fuller's old-fashioned revival hour reached 20 million listeners weekly by 1940, making him more influential than any denominational leader in American history. But Fuller answered to no bishop, no presbytery, no convention. His authority came directly from his audience. The same was true for dozens of other radio evangelists. They created a new model of religious authority, the celebrity minister whose power derived from personal charisma and media savvy rather than ecclesiastical position. The denominations initially tried to fight this by demanding equal time on radio stations or creating their own programming. The Federal Council of Churches, representing the mainline denominations, negotiated free airtime from the major networks in the 1920s and 1930s. But their programming was formal, liturgical, and boring compared to the independent evangelists. Even faithful denominational members tuned out. The battle for broadcast authority was over before it really began, and the denominations had lost. But the knockout blow came from an unexpected direction: the federal government. Throughout the 19th century, denominations had worked hand in glove with government, providing social services, running schools, and shaping policy. That cozy relationship began to dissolve rapidly after 1933. The New Deal fundamentally restructured the relationship between religion and social welfare in America. For over a century, if you were destitute, you turned to your church or denominational charities. After the New Deal, you turned to the government. Social Security, passed in 1935, didn't just provide retirement benefits. It transferred the care of the elderly from families and churches to the federal bureaucracy. Unemployment insurance meant workers no longer depended on church-based mutual aid societies. Federal housing programs replaced denominational settlement houses. Within a single generation, the denominations lost their role as the primary providers of social services in America. And when you're no longer the one helping people in their darkest moments, you lose moral authority over their lives. I want you to pause here and think about something. What profession are you in, and does religious authority play any role in it today? Drop that in the comments. I'm genuinely curious to see how different fields have been affected by this shift. And while you're down there, if you're finding this deep dive into hidden history valuable, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps Professor Archive keep digging into the forgotten stories that shaped our world. The pattern accelerated after World War II. The GI Bill sent millions of men to college who never would have attended otherwise, creating the most educated generation in American history. But education corroded denominational loyalty. A 1955 study found that college-educated Christians were 60% less likely to believe denominational distinctives mattered compared to those with only high school education. The more educated Americans became, the less they cared whether they were Presbyterian or Methodist, Baptist, or Episcopalian. They started church shopping based on convenience, programs, and the personality of the local pastor rather than denominational identity. Suburbanization made this worse. When Americans moved to the suburbs in massive numbers after 1945, they left behind the urban ethnic neighborhoods where denominational identity was deeply rooted. In the suburb, you weren't the Italian Catholic or the German Lutheran. You were just another homeowner. The new suburban churches that sprouted up everywhere were often intentionally generic, downplaying denominational distinctives to appeal to the mobile, educated middle class. Here's a telling statistic. In 1940, 73% of American Protestants could correctly identify their denomination's distinctive theological beliefs. By 1980, only 28% could do the same. The denominations had become brands without meaning, labels without content. People stayed nominally affiliated, but the denominations no longer shaped how they thought, voted, spent money, or lived their lives. The Supreme Court delivered another series of devastating blows starting in the 1960s. The school prayer decisions, Engel versus Vitale in 1962, and Abington School District versus Schempp in 1963, removed the last vestiges of informal denominational influence over public education. But even more significant was the 1970 decision in Walds versus Tax Commission, which, while upholding tax exemptions for churches, significantly narrowed the definition of permissible religious influence in public life. The court essentially told religious organizations, you can have your tax exemption, but stay in your lane and don't try to shape public policy the way you did for the first 180 years of American history. Denominations found themselves increasingly unable to discipline their own members or enforce their own teachings. Consider the United Methodist Church. In 1972, they added language to their Book of Discipline, stating that homosexual practice was incompatible with Christian teaching. Sounds like a clear denominational position, right? But they proved completely unable to enforce it. Over the next 47 years, hundreds of Methodist ministers performed same-sex weddings in direct violation of denominational law. Bishops tried to enforce discipline. They failed repeatedly. Some ministers were brought to trial and acquitted by sympathetic juries of fellow clergy. Others were convicted and then reinstated on appeal. The denomination's authority existed only on paper. The same paralysis afflicted other denominations. The Presbyterian Church USA couldn't enforce their constitution. The Episcopal Church couldn't prevent parishes from leaving en masse. The American Baptist churches couldn't stop congregations from going their own way. The enforcement mechanisms that worked in 1890, when denominations could threaten social and economic exclusion, simply didn't function in modern America, where denominational affiliation meant almost nothing to employers, neighbors, or even fellow church members. But perhaps the most fascinating development was the rise of the non-denominational church. In 1970, there were fewer than 1,000 non-denominational churches in America. Today, there are over 35,000, and they include some of the largest and most influential churches in the country: Saddleback, Willow Creek, North Point, Lakewood. These churches explicitly rejected denominational authority and created their own networks, franchises almost, based on successful ministry models. They discovered something the denominations had forgotten. In consumer-oriented America, people wanted churches that worked for them, not ecclesiastical structures demanding their loyalty. Here's where the story takes its darkest turn. As denominations lost cultural authority, they also lost the ability to maintain moral authority over their own institutions. The Catholic abuse crisis is well known, but similar scandals have plagued Protestant denominations, and their weakened authority structures made them unable to respond effectively. When the Southern Baptist Convention faced revelations in 2022 that denomination leaders had systematically covered up sexual abuse for decades, they discovered they had no real mechanism to discipline member churches or remove them from the convention. The congregational polity that once seemed like freedom had become a recipe for unaccountability. The financial decline tells the same story. Between 1970 and 2020, mainline Protestant denominations lost approximately 60% of their membership. but they lost over 75% of their real financial resources when adjusted for inflation. The denominational bureaucracies that once employed thousands have been gutted. The United Methodist Church, which in 1970 employed over 3,000 people in various boards and agencies, now employs fewer than 500. The Presbyterian Church USA has sold off most of its national properties, including its historic headquarters building. These aren't just budget cuts. They represent the total collapse of institutions that once rivaled corporations and government agencies in their reach and power. Television accelerated everything that radio started. The televangelists of the 1980s and 1990s, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Jimmy Swaggart, Jim Bakker, built media empires that dwarfed denominational institutions. Falwell's moral majority had more political influence in the 1980s than all the mainline denominational offices combined. But notice, Falwell was an independent Baptist. He answered to no denominational authority. When he fell into scandal, no denomination could discipline him. When Robertson made outrageous statements, no bishop could silence him. The age of denominational gatekeeping was over. The internet completed the demolition. When anyone with a laptop can start a ministry, publish theology, and gather a following, denominational control of religious information becomes impossible. YouTube pastors and Instagram theologians have replaced denominational publishing houses. TikTok devotionals compete with Sunday sermons. The barriers to entry that denominations once controlled have vanished entirely. But here's the plot twist you might not see coming. The collapse of denominational authority hasn't led to secularization the way many predicted. Instead, it's led to radical individualization and fragmentation of American religion. Americans are more likely than ever to describe themselves as spiritual. They're more likely to pray regularly, but they construct their own personalized belief systems from bits and pieces of various traditions, often with no denominational guidance whatsoever. The 2020 Pew Research Survey found that 62% of American Christians hold beliefs their own denomination officially rejects, and most don't even know it. This fragmentation has political consequences that reshaped America. When denominations held authority, they could moderate political extremism within their ranks. A Southern Baptist deacon who started spouting radical politics would be quietly disciplined by his church. A Presbyterian elder who embraced fringe conspiracy theories would be counseled by his session. Those moderating structures are gone. American religion has become a wild west where anyone can claim divine authority for any political position, and no denominational structure exists to push back. The rise of Christian nationalism in the 21st century is partly a consequence of denominational collapse. When the old mainline denominations held cultural power, they had a vested interest in maintaining the stability of American institutions. They were those institutions. But the new religious entrepreneurs, the megachurch pastors, the media personalities, the independent church networks have no such institutional loyalty. They can embrace radical politics without risking denominational censure because they don't belong to denominations with the power to censure them. Consider this striking contrast. In 1960, when the National Council of Churches, representing the mainline denominations, issued statements on civil rights, politicians listened because those denominations represented consolidated religious authority. In 2020, when various religious leaders issued statements about racial justice or election integrity, their impact was minimal because they represented only fragmented constituencies with no broader institutional backing. The megaphone got smaller as the voices multiplied. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed just how complete the collapse had become. When public health officials asked religious leaders to close churches temporarily, they discovered there was no one to ask. The mainline denominations had no power to close member churches. The Catholic dioceses tried with mixed results and fierce pushback. But the tens of thousands of independent and non-denominational churches made their own decisions, and no authority structure could compel them otherwise. The fragmentation that had been building for a century became suddenly starkly visible. But let me share something that might surprise you. Some scholars argue this collapse represents not a crisis, but a return to the American founding vision. The Constitution, after all, forbade religious tests for office and guaranteed free exercise. The denominational authority that collapsed was always somewhat alien to American ideals, a holdover from European state churches that the founders had explicitly rejected. From this perspective, the 20th century didn't witness a collapse but a correction, a painful adjustment to what American religion was always supposed to be: voluntary, pluralistic, and free from institutional coercion. There's something to this argument. The era of denominational authority was also an era of religious exclusion and oppression. When Methodists controlled a town, Catholics faced discrimination. When Episcopalians dominated the elite, Baptists were excluded. The collapse of that system opened space for religious diversity and innovation. The explosion of ethnic churches, immigrant religious communities, and new religious movements in late 20th century America would have been impossible under the old denominational regime. But we've also lost something real. The denominational system, for all its flaws, provided theological education, historical continuity, institutional memory, and a check on the wildest religious impulses. When Christianity is reduced to individual preference, when pastors need no training, and churches no accountability, when anyone with charisma can build a following and claim divine authority, the results aren't always benign. The denominational authorities may have been stuffed shirts in bureaucratic offices, but they also preserved traditions, maintained standards, and occasionally said no to bad ideas. The numbers tell a sobering story. In 1960, approximately 75% of American Protestant clergy had seminary education supervised by denominational institutions. Today, that number is below 35%. In 1960, most churches were subject to some form of outside accountability, whether bishops, presbyteries, conventions, or associations. Today, over 40% of American Protestant churches are completely independent, answerable to no one but themselves. We've gained freedom, we've lost accountability. Whether that trade was worth it depends on your perspective. As we approach the end of this story, I want you to consider a question. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are? I love imagining this global community learning together, whether it's morning coffee in California or late night in Singapore. Drop your location and time in the comments. It reminds us we're part of something bigger than ourselves, which is fitting for a story about the institutions that once connected us. And before we finish, if this deep dive has given you a new perspective on American religious history, consider hitting that super thanks button. Creating these detailed historical investigations takes serious research time, and your support keeps Professor Archive digging into the stories that textbooks overlook. So where does this leave us? The collapse of denominational authority in America is essentially complete. The structures that once shaped American religious life for centuries have been reduced to hollow shells or swept away entirely. What comes next is anyone's guess. Perhaps we're witnessing the birth of entirely new forms of religious organization, built around digital communities and parasocial relationships with media personalities. Perhaps we're seeing a return to more ancient, pre-institutional forms of Christianity, organized around charismatic leaders and loose networks. Or perhaps Americans will simply continue doing what they've been doing, constructing personalized spiritualities from whatever sources appeal to them, untethered from any institutional authority. The irony is that this collapse happened largely without anyone noticing or objecting. Unlike the Reformation, which involved wars and martyrs, the collapse of American denominational authority happened quietly, through 1,000 small decisions and compromises. The denominations didn't fall to conquerors, they didn't succumb to persecution. They simply became irrelevant, and by the time they noticed, it was far too late to reverse course. As you go about your day, look around at the religious landscape, if you're in America or watching American religious culture from abroad. Those big denominational churches on the town square, the ones with the historical markers and the impressive architecture, most of them are struggling or have closed. The thriving congregations are often in strip malls and converted warehouses, with no denominational signage and no connection to the religious institutions that shaped America for 2 centuries. That physical transformation of the landscape mirrors the deeper transformation we've been exploring. The hidden collapse of denominational authority in America is one of the most significant yet least discussed transformations of modern American life. It reshaped politics, altered culture, transformed communities, and redefined what it means to be religious in America. And it happened right under our noses, one small change at a time, until the entire structure had crumbled. Now, you know the story that most Americans never learned. How the religious authorities that once rivaled the government itself in power and influence simply faded away, leaving behind a fragmented, individualized religious landscape that would be almost unrecognizable to Americans of just a century ago. The denominations are still there technically, but their authority? That collapsed long ago and it's not coming back.